My name is Jill, and I'm part of Kensington's Move Out team. Thank you so much for your heart to move out. Whether you're interested in serving locally or globally, our heart is to equip you and empower you to use what God has put in your hands to love and serve others wherever He is calling you. One of our key values here at Kensington is to live with open-handedness, and that means joyfully releasing all that we have for the plans and purposes of God. And wow, Kensington folks are so generous with their time, their treasures, their talents, and it is such an honor and a privilege to be on mission with you. The Bible teaches us to love our neighbors and to be generous with what we have to help those in need. In Matthew 25, verses 34 through 40, Jesus is telling us to feed and quench and clothe and heal those in need. And He takes it a step further and He says that when we do that for others, we're actually doing that for Him. We are loving and serving Jesus Himself. And in 1 John 3, verses 17 and 18, again, we are being challenged to demonstrate our love through generosity and through action. We're being invited to put our love into action. So as followers of Christ, we're certainly called to be generous and to be loving and to help others. But we also need to be wise in our giving and serving, because sometimes our best of intentions can actually do more harm than good. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. How do we have this heart for serving, and how in our serving do we love and dignify others? Now, I want to begin by looking at a story in the Bible. I'm going to read from Acts chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. So if you have your Bibles, you can read along as well. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 in the afternoon. Now, a man who was lame from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those going to the temple courts. When he saw Peter and John about to enter, he asked them for money. Peter looked straight at him, as did John, and then Peter said, "Look at us." So the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. Then Peter said, "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." And taking him by the right hand, he helped him up, and instantly the man's feet and ankles became strong. He jumped up to his feet and began to walk. And then he went with them into the temple courts, walking and jumping and praising God. And when all the people saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the same man who used to be sitting at the temple gate begging. And they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. Now think about this man who's been carried to the temple gate day after day to beg. When Peter and John encountered him, the easy thing to do would have been to toss some coins into his cup or onto his mat and carry it on along their way. After all, that was what the man thought he needed. That was what the man wanted. But how do you think that man felt after enduring this lifetime of difficulty, of marginalization, and living off of the mercy of others? Do you think a handout would have helped to fix any of that? Or is there a chance that that handout might have actually made him feel worse? And that's something that we want to be thinking about. Because I realize there's this tension in wanting to help others. On the one hand, we see all of these needs around us, these burdens, these overwhelming needs, and we're just moved to help, right? We feel compelled to help any way we can. But then on the other hand, we want to be wise in our giving and serving. We want to make sure that what we do really does help someone, and we definitely don't want to do anything that harms them. So, how do we help people without causing harm? To press into that, we need to start with a more complete understanding of poverty. So when you think of the word poverty, what comes to mind for you? How would you define it? How would you describe it? So often we define poverty as material lack, lacking things like food, clothing, shelter, clean water. And as a result, our response is to give people the things that they lack, to give them stuff. If you think about the man at the temple gate, he lacked the money that he needed to pay for basic necessities. People had compassion on him, and they gave him money. And I'm sure in a way it did help. Yet poverty is so much more complex than that, and material poverty is just one symptom of many. If you think about going into the doctor's office with an ailment, an ache, or a pain, if the doctor were to misdiagnose your problem or treat only the symptoms, not only would you not get better, but potentially you could get much worse. Poverty is similar to that. So at Kensington, we're trying to learn how to look at poverty differently so that we can respond in ways that are loving and honoring and dignifying. We want to be able to help people without hurting. Before we continue, I just want to make a mention of two great resources. Much of what I'm sharing today is based on the wonderful guidance that we have from a book called When Helping Hurts, written by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert, and all of the work that they've done at the Chalmers Center. In addition to that, there's a great book called Toxic Charity, written by Robert D. Lupton. I highly recommend both of these books if you want to press in deeper to this idea of poverty, poverty alleviation, and the right response to serving and charitable giving. Now, back to that question about poverty. The World Bank did a study where they interviewed thousands of people who were materially poor, and they asked them the same question. They asked them, what does poverty look like to you? How would you describe or define it? And the overwhelming majority of people described poverty more in terms of psychological, social, emotional issues than a mention of material lack. They said poverty felt like being inferior. It brought on feelings of shame, hopelessness, depression. They spoke of things like social isolation, fear, of having no voice, of having no power to change their circumstances because they were poor. I wonder how the man at the temple gate felt. I wonder if he ever felt helpless or hopeless, if he ever felt unseen or unheard as well. Have you ever felt that way? I know that I have. And I think about how that is something that we all have in common. And a handout wouldn't fix that, and a handout could potentially have even made those feelings worse. And that's because poverty is so much more than material lack. Poverty is actually rooted in 4 key relationships that were designed for us by God, but yet broken by the fall. God is a God of relationship. And as image bearers, we were created for relationship as well. We were created for relationship with Him, relationship with ourselves, which means a sense of self. We were created for a relationship with others, and then the rest of creation. These relationships are so foundational. They are the building blocks of life. And when they're functioning properly, we are experiencing the fullness of life just as God intended for us. The first relationship, our relationship with God, is key. This is the relationship from which all the other relationships flow. We were created to love God and to glorify Him through our actions, our words, by living our lives for Him. This is our calling. Next, we have a relationship with self. We were created in the image of God, and we were given inherent dignity and worth. A healthy relationship with self means seeing ourselves the way that God does. Next comes our relationship with others. Not only do we need to see ourselves as God does, but others as well. We were created to see people, to know them, to love them, to encourage them. We were created to live in community. Next comes our relationship with the rest of creation, and here God calls us to be good stewards. He calls us to pursue work that is joyful and satisfying. He calls us to live off the fruit of that labor and to use our gifts in the world. Think about what life would look like if these relationships were intact, if they were healthy and whole, if they were flourishing. And yet through the fall, sin and brokenness entered the world, and these 4 relationships were damaged as a result. In our relationship with God, intimacy was replaced with a sense of separation and fear, and now there's people all over the world who don't know Him. In our relationship with self, our true identities were clouded over by false ones. That sense of dignity was replaced with an unworthiness, a feeling of shame. In our relationship with others, our sense of community was replaced with conflict, self-interest, marginalization of people who are not like us. And our relationship with the rest of creation, here we see joyful work being replaced with toilsome labor. We see it replaced with laziness, workaholism, greed, entitlement. Definitely not the view of work that God has for us. This is what true poverty looks like. It's the broken relationships that are at the foundation of our lives. And with this broader perspective in mind, we're all poor. I'm poor. You're poor. And so are the people that we're wanting to help. If we define poverty as only material lack and therefore give out material things, not only are we not addressing those underlying issues, but we could actually be causing more harm than good. Going back to this man at the gate, if he's feeling ashamed, if he's feeling powerless about his circumstances, those handouts would only make those feelings worse. In addition to that, for those of us who are trying to help, if in any way we feel superior, if we think we need to rescue or fix someone, if we think we know better than they do, those are all symptoms of poverty, just like the feeling of powerlessness and shame that the materially poor may be experiencing. And in this case, a handout could actually be deepening poverty for both the giver and the receiver. So how do we help without hurting? Well, if poverty is rooted in these 4 broken relationships, then poverty alleviation happens through reconciliation. By moving both ourselves and others into these right relationships with God, ourselves, others, and the rest of creation. When Peter and John encountered this man at the temple gate, they didn't give him money. Instead, they gave him so much more. They gave him something so much better. First, they took the time to stop and to notice him. They saw him. And I love how when they saw the man, they said, "Look at us." And I just pictured this man on the ground, raising up his head, their eyes meeting, and him feeling seen. And I just picture him maybe feeling seen for the first time in a long, long time. I envision that sense of feeling seen and noticed, awakening a sense of dignity and worth. And I picture that encounter moving him one step closer in his right relationship with self. In addition to that, Peter and John introduced him to Jesus. They said, "In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, get up and walk." Whether this man knew Jesus or not, he knew Peter and John did. And he knew where the miraculous power was coming from. And I just picture here in this moment that encounter moved him one step closer into a right relationship with God as well. They inspired him and gave him the faith and the courage he needed to be healed. And then when he was healed, he went with them to the temple gates. He went with them into community. And he was walking and jumping and praising God. And I just picture these people coming alongside him and seeing what God had done in his life, his testimony. He was using what was in his hands to inspire others. Because our testimony is so powerful, it's something we have in his hands. And I picture in this encounter him moving one step closer to right relationship with others. And then I think about how he was likely able to retire that beggar's cup and begin working to provide for himself and his family and others, and how that might have moved him into one step closer into that right relationship with the rest of creation, because that's where God's idea of work fits. That's the relationship it falls into. And now, I don't want to pull too much out of this story, but I just think that it's such a beautiful example of how we can help people move closer to who God created them to be. So as we face poverty in this world around us, we can be thinking about how we can help people realize their inherent worth, how we can help them discover their own strengths and abilities, how we can help them use what they have in their hand and stand on their own 2 feet, so to speak. And most important of all, let's be thinking about how we can introduce them to the one that makes this all possible, because that's Jesus Christ. Remember, because poverty is rooted in brokenness, poverty alleviation takes a miracle. And that miracle is Jesus. In a war on poverty, Christians have a unique and powerful role to play. Not because we're wealthy, not because we're blessed, not even because we're called to be generous with what we've been given. We have a unique and powerful role to play because we know Jesus Christ, because we can introduce people to him. He's the only one who can save. He's the only one who can start to heal those broken relationships in our lives. in our lives and those we're trying to help. As followers of Jesus, our role is to be ambassadors of that reconciliation. So this deeper look at poverty wasn't intended to say, stop helping the poor for fear of causing harm. Instead, it was meant to challenge us, to inspire us to do even more, to see those around us, to be moved by compassion, to respond in ways that bring us all closer to the hope and to the dignity that God intends for us. We are His image bearers, and He has so much in store for us. Now, the first step in trying to help others without hurting them is to correctly diagnose the situation, right? Go back to that idea of the doctor's office. Different situations will call for different responses. So a question we want to ask ourselves as we're entering into a situation is whether or not this is an emergency or this is a chronic and ongoing need. When someone is in crisis, an emergency response is needed. And here we want to think about things like a sudden illness, accident, a tragedy. Think about this pandemic that we're going through, or a natural disaster like a hurricane or the winter storm that plagued the South. When people are in crisis, we want to keep in mind what our sources call the 3 T's. The first T is timing. In an emergency, it is important to give quickly so that we can address the most urgent needs. The second T is targeted, and this means giving only what is immediately useful and specifically requested by those who are in the field. Now, the best option is usually going to be money, and money that's gifted through reputable partners. If you're familiar with Kensington, we have partners around the world. We have partners here locally. And when we come alongside them with our financial gifts, we help them to respond to the most immediate needs in the field, to purchase the right things at the right time. The next best option is to give whatever else is specifically requested, again by those reputable partners in the field. Not what we think is best, not what we have as extra or available, not what we find when we're cleaning out our closets, our basements, our garages. Think about it this way. Just because somebody has lost everything, that does not mean that they need everything. And so often relief organizations are just flooded with things that are not right for the situation. They can't be moved, they can't be stored, they can't be distributed properly. And those are items that can go to waste. Even worse, those are items that can get in the way, things that can detract the emergency response teams from attending to the most critical needs, because they take up space, they take up time, they take up resources. So the first T is timing, and we want to be immediate. The second T is targeted. The third T is temporary, because once that immediate crisis is over, we need to shift from relief to development. We need to shift from immediate results to longer-term results. Where is God prompting you to give and to serve? Is there a problem that breaks your heart? Is there a cause that compels you to get involved? Whether your heart is for refugees or orphans, victims of trafficking, social injustice or abuse, or maybe you have a heart for the materially poor in general, wherever you're feeling called, just be aware that the needs that you're going to come across are most likely chronic rather than crisis in nature. And chronic needs call for a response that is based on development rather than relief. Think in terms of that hand up rather than the hand out. This means doing things with those that you're trying to serve rather than for them or to them. This means not doing for the materially poor what they can or should have the capacity to do for themselves, because to do so would disempower them. To do so would further fracture those broken relationships that we've been talking about with God, self, others, and the rest of creation. And not only fraction those relationships for them, but for us as the helpers and the givers as well. These are the unintended consequences of a response that is not correct for the situation. Instead, we should be striving to equip and empower people. And to do so, we want to walk alongside them. We want to help reconcile those broken relationships and ours. We want to help them determine their own gifts and talents. We want to provide them to access that will help them better their lives for themselves and their families. Things like job training, employment networks, life skills training. And of course, we want to provide love and encouragement and support along the way. We talked about what some of the feelings the materially poor can experience, how it feels to be ashamed or powerless or voiceless. Think about how incredible it would be if you had a champion in your corner spurring you on and giving you encouragement. So think about it. These are all things that we have in our hands to share. Now the challenge here is that it actually takes time and commitment to build relationships, to walk alongside others, to build trust and accountability and partnership. I mean, if I'm being honest, it's a lot easier to toss the coins in the cup, to write the check, to send off the bag of clothes. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely times and places where that is helpful. But if poverty is rooted in these 4 broken relationships, then it's going to take more than that. It's going to take reconciliation, and that's the hard work. So when it comes to giving and serving, we should begin, first of all, with this deeper understanding of poverty. And then we need to recognize the poverty in our own lives and let it cultivate in us a posture of a learner, a posture of humility. Because again, poverty is something we all have in common. Next, we should look at how we can take steps to repair these 4 foundational relationships designed for us by God, for ourselves and for those we're serving. This means sharing the love of Christ in ways that affirm a person's dignity, their identity, their value. This means helping people to discover their God-gifted resources, purposes, abilities. This means helping people to realize, then develop, then use what they have in their hands. Because all of us have something to give, and all of us have something where we can mutually use to benefit each other. The aim here, again, is to equip and to empower, and to focus on longer-term sustainable results. And because broken people can create broken systems and processes, God may even be calling you to step into or stand against a broken process that may be impeding somebody's development and growth. Pray about who it is that God is calling you to love. Pray about where He's calling you to serve. Ask God, what do I have in my hand, and how do you want me to use it to help others? And then just move out as He leads. Take that step. So just as Christ helps us to overcome poverty in our own lives, He can help those we serve by giving them an encounter through us. Thank you.